Hi, everyone. So excited. I'm Marina Morozova, and I'm an accessibility experience designer. And my background is not just in accessibility and UX, but also in linguistics, and I was teacher for a while. And today I'm going to talk about how to reduce barriers for people with limited English proficiency through thoughtful content, but also through inclusive design. All right. So access to digital products and having understandable content is a lifeline. It's not a luxury. Why is it a lifeline? Because access to digital products um, makes really critical everyday tasks possible, like paying your rent, opening a bank account, um, honestly, even reading product labels at a pet store that you shop online. Um, like, I don't want to have any fish in my cat's food. Um, and those things should not be hidden behind a barrier. And the barrier can be, you know, content that is too complex, too complicated to understand, or also it can be design that this content is wrapped into. I think a really good example of how critical clear content is and how critical inclusive design is ATM. So one, um, the topic of money is generally, I think, very loaded and can be nerve-wracking and like anxiety-inducing for a bunch of people. And but also it's so much about autonomy. Like you always want to be able to deal with an ATM when you need to deal with an ATM. And you can have an ideal situation. Let's say you are withdrawing money from an ATM that is from your bank in in the country where you live, or in the country that the main language you speak. You're not in a rush. No one is behind you in the line, and the screen of the ATM works perfectly. The design hasn't been updated in a while, so you don't have to deal with like your bank releasing a new design and you having to like find your way through a new ATM interface. Um, and maybe it's even the ATM that you always go to that is close to your home or close to your work or whatever. And if you take one piece out of this ideal situation, I think it can become worrying enough. So one, you can have a background or a story of um, anxiety, trauma connected to financial questions, or you can have a history of being worried about carrying cash around, or you can be in a rush and then you have to solve the ATM task really quickly, or you can have a bunch of people behind you who are in a rush, or you can have all of this and you're at Times Square where everyone is in a rush. And to any of that, you can also add, and you are not facing the ATM that is in the language that you are proficient in. I think this can be super frustrating, and this can take agency really quickly away from a person in a very critical everyday task. So we're here in New York, main language is English, and also so much of content online is in English. So English is totally dominating the web content. On the graph here that I have from Statista, it shows that in February 2025, English was the dominating language at 49.4%, which is almost a half. And then after that, we have Spanish, German. So Spanish at 6%, German at 5.6%, and Japanese at 5%, and then all the other languages are less than 5%. And so we can definitely say that not 49% of all the people interacting with a digital product have English as their main language. So, and if we leave people with limited English proficiency out, then we leave users out, and we can lose our potential users, customers, clients, or we can put our existing customers, clients, users under pressure of understanding more than they are able to. All right, and with that in mind, let's talk presentation goals for today. So by the end, I hope that you'll walk out of here knowing more about writing clear, respectful, and intuitive content, applying design strategies to reduce cognitive load, using just the necessary amount of users' attention span, and supporting multilingual and culturally diverse users. Oh yeah, and you might notice that I have a weird-looking cat on the slide. I found a few of medieval cats that are scattered around the slides. I tried my best to find ones that match the topic. Not always, digital contact, medieval cats. And also, I'm a recent first-time cat mom, so it only felt true that to include my baby in the digital way here. All right, so let's talk about users with different language proficiencies. So speakers of different languages, or like speakers of English, vary in their skills, and the skills vary by background, age, exposure, and context, which is a really interesting thing. Language speakers are not a homogeneous group. We should not generalize, we should not label when we talk about this, and do our best to avoid terms like native speaker, non-native speaker, which honestly have a colonial background, so we don't want to use that. And also when we talk about people's language proficiency, it's best to not talk about what they are not or what they cannot do, but rather what they can do, right? And so this is why I love the term people with limited English proficiency. I think it's very descriptive and it's not judgmental. It's just stating a fact. It's not making any assumptions. And for anyone, poorly designed content is a barrier. But for people with a limited language proficiency, 100%. Poorly designed content or poorly presented content can create cognitive overload. It adds to anxiety, the ATM example. It makes the use of technology difficult. And I'm going to talk about the apps that scan text, like the text recognition software. It takes away users' independence and chances for success. And also it leaves the user disappointed and possibly avoiding a digital product, which, if we produce a product, we don't want that. And it's about respect. It's about respecting your user, talking in the language, in the level that they can understand you in. So how can we make content more accessible and reduce stress for speakers of limited English? So this was the intro. Let's get to the, business part of it. Okay, so the center is the plain language. So our guidelines are use plain language, which is the level of lower secondary education, which is 7th to 9th grade. And for that, we have the WCAG 2.2 success criterion reading level. Then it's not just important what the text is, but also how the text is presented. We need meaningful headings. We need structure that improves scannability. We want to aim for 15 to 25 words per sentence and 45, 74 characters per line to not create this like unreadable wall of text that just overwhelms the user when they face it. For meaningful headings and structure, one example would be if a user has a limited language skills or like limited reading comprehension, we don't want to make them read through a very long unstructured text, right? Maybe not the whole page is relevant for them. They want to be able to find exactly the section that is relevant for them and then only read that without spending any cognitive effort on the other part of the text. Like if I'm in a cafe abroad, I want to know if I can bring my laptop on the weekend or not. And I don't want to read through a bunch of rules somewhere that are in the very small font, right? I wanna see this part somewhere. Avoid abbreviations and acronyms before mentioning the full word. And we have a success criterion for that too, abbreviations, and then avoid idioms, phrasal verbs, and metaphors. So if we talk about the use of acronyms and abbreviations, I think a good example is annual percentage rate, APR. I think you can see it so often in the States in the ads for credit cards. It seems like it's a very well-known concept for people who grew up in a culture that uses credit cards, and probably for people who grew up with some level of financial education. But for example, if we talk about Germany, that is not as dominated by credit card use, then APR might not be a default known concept. So we want to introduce it first before using the abbreviation. And then for idioms, phrasal verbs, and metaphors, it's so much easier to understand the word mail versus even snail mail. Or, instead of look up, you can do search. And then for idioms also, saving for a rainy day is, I think, such a good example, because if there is a website that talks about a savings account, it's easier to understand when it's just saving and not saving plus some qualifiers. Like, is for the rainy day critical to understand this, or is it just words there? So just saving is so much easier. And even when you can kind of guess the meaning of an idiom from the context, you're still spending some cognitive load on understanding that. And again, if it's a anxiety-related situation, we don't want to take any cognitive effort from the user. All right, so let's flow to flows and instructions. Consistent flows and consistent icons are such a great support, huge love. Then we want to have clear task instructions. And for that, we even have a WCAG success criterion, labels or instructions. A user needs enough time to process and have the information presented in manageable segments. It's related to structure and headings, but even those headings need to have a manageable amount of content under them. And then ensure that there is enough error prevention and easy recovery if an error is made. And then last on the slide, I have plan for accessible content and presentation early in the design process. I was hoping that by putting it in the end of the slide and by the absurdity of the late part and talking about the early, this will get it more highlighted. All right, then if we talk about audio, video, and multimedia, there are some very basic, well-known rules, right? Like provide subtitles, captions, and transcripts. Nonverbal communication matters, and it can include gestures, tone, facial expressions. One of my favorites is allowing pauses between sentences in audio rather than between words. So because a sentence is a chunk of information with a bunch of words, it's easier to understand when it's a finished thought. And then after the thought is finished, you can take some time to process it, right? Versus if it's a pause after each word, and then you don't know if this is the word that you really need to understand, or you can just ignore it if you don't know it and go further. And be mindful of accent comprehension barriers. So I remember that in early 2000s, mid 2000s, there was this video of a elevator that was voice operated that was not able to recognize someone's I think it was Scottish accent. So I think, this is a situation where someone clearly has a high language proficiency, but also has a certain accent, which doesn't mean that they didn't grow up speaking this language. But still, it makes it difficult to perceive or difficult to operate. And I think in New York, we are in such a good situation because we face so many accents on a daily basis, right? There are people who speak English as their primary language and have an accent. There are people who don't speak English as their primary language and have an accent. And I think here we're well trained for a bunch of accents that people have, be it from an English speaking country where English is the main language, or where people just learned English at school or like in some other situation. Okay, yes. Oh, yeah, and of course I have a cat here. So audio and video, there's a cat with, I would say, a medium struggling pace, and with something that looks like a bagpipe, maybe. I don't know. All right, one more cat and more about multimedia. If we move from just audio and video to, the whole multimedia thing, background audio, autoplay, unnecessary pop-ups, and stuff moving around are not a friend. My personal enemy is the background audio because I don't know what to listen to. Then we need to have content in multiple modalities: text, video, images. And also, I know I already said it, but subtitles, captions, and transcripts are so super helpful. And also, I wanted to mention Calm technology. It's the concept that I learned about a few years ago, but it's been around for a really long time. And it teaches us that technology needs to simplify complexities, not introduce new ones. And I really love it in this context because, let's say, a user with limited English comes to a website that does not exist in a different language. They have to interact with it in English. And this website should not be super overwhelming. It needs to take the exact amount of attention from the user that is actually needed to solve a problem, and not just be like a Times Square of the website where you don't know where to look and you don't know what to interact with. I know I mentioned Times Square twice already, but oh, did I? Oh yeah, and another cat, I think playing lute, I don't know, but definitely also medieval. What else? And then also to go from content and design to a little bit more of a technology side of that. For seamless technology use, correct language tags are really critical. And we have WCAG 2.2 success criteria for that: language of parts and language of page. So let's say there is a German website that is mostly in German, but there are a few pages that are translated into English for international users. But the language tags, even on the English content pages, are still German. And then if it gets read out by a screen reader, it will be read out, it will be English read out with a beautiful German accent that, would be pretty difficult to understand. I think for a person whose English, for whom English is their primary language, because the words just sound so differently, but definitely for a person who has a limited English proficiency. Language tags. And then also, we need enough time to translate the content as needed. If something needs to be translated, if the user needs to step away, we need to ensure that the page doesn't log them out, that they still can come and continue the task where they left it off, that there are enough warnings, how much time they have before they get logged out, etc. I know that this is easier now when the vocabulary or Google Translate is in the next tab to the to the website, but still. All right, and also to continue the technology stuff, I want to talk about OCR, which stands for, about optical character recognition, ACR. So here I have two screenshots. One is Google Translate app, and it's the button with the helper text that says, take a photo of words to translate. I think this button is labeled as instant camera translation in the app itself. And then the second one is the iOS detect text function in the camera app or in the photo app. So both of these optical character recognition softwares will work best if there is strong color contrast, if the fonts are legible, and if there is a simple layout. When I talk about simple layout, I think about like mid-2000s magazines and mid-2000s because I don't remember when I bought a printed magazine the last time, but it had let's say like the heading in big letters in the middle of the page, and then the article would be around the heading. So in this situation, visually, we can understand which part is the bigger text and which part is the heading. But if we talk about the optical character recognition software, it might put this larger text in the middle of the other line text. And I think also another context for that would be if you're trying to translate a chart, if you're trying to use the text recognition on a chart, it might also read it not top to bottom, left to right. Oh, sorry, mirrored. Top to bottom, left to right. But it might just go line by line, and then it's your own task to understand which part belongs together. Yeah, and here also we need enough time to translate the content as needed. For strong color contrast, I think, and it's another point going back to the ATM. If the ATM screen is, cracked and not as bright as it should be, if the sun outside of the branch, or if it's a drive-through ATM, is too bright, and then the user who, let's say, doesn't speak any of the languages that ATM offers, and they try to scan it with their Google Translate app, something might not be caught if the contrast is not high enough. Okay, you might notice that the design here kind of like asks for something on the side, of the slide, and you might ask me, is there a medieval cat for that slide? There is no cat, but there are traces of a cat. And I think this is such a good fit for talking about text recognition, because this is handwritten and this is not a modern font. I think it's pretty difficult to recognize with a software. And also there is a pattern of a cat that walked with their paws and left ink stains on the manuscript, which, would also be in the way of recognizing the text. But I want, to give this text a positive spin. The contrast is really good because it's black text on white background, so at least one thing. All right. Okay. So takeaways, the cat that you already saw at the goals slide. We want content and digital experiences to bring joy, dignity, and empowerment. When someone learned a foreign language, when someone acquired a higher proficiency in a language that maybe they didn't grow up with, it's really empowering to be able to complete a task on your own without anyone's help, having enough time to complete the task, having a task description that is clear enough. So write clear, respectful, and intuitive content. Plan for accessible content and presentation early in design, the classic. Use accessibility principles to reduce cognitive load, and less noise and more intention. And before I go to questions and answers, I want to ask you to consider. How can your content reduce stress for your users with limited English proficiency? All right, so this is a thing to think about on your way back. The resources I have are the WCAG guidelines. It's the guideline 2.2 enough time, the guideline readable, and then other resources that I used for this presentation and that I use are US Federal Plain Language Guidelines, really good. Designing content for people with limited English. This is a UK.gov design website, which is amazing. Writing for an ESL audience. And then another article that the last link is the article that I think gives a really good span about, really good perspective on people and their language abilities. It's about native speakerism, what is it and why does it matter? And then also, as promised, some tools for plain language. Hemingway app, Flash Kincaid app, readable. They are focused on determining the level for, I think, American context, and also for English, but also not English languages, Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, CEFR, has a CEFR text analyzer, and it allows you to just paste the text that you have a question about, and it will tell you if it's like the basic proficiency or higher or, unlimited proficiency. Yeah. And then for questions and answers, I have this questionable cat in a snail shell. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Ooh. All right. Thanks, Irina. That was awesome. I'm gonna have to go back through all your slides and dig deep on them. That's amazing. Okay, we'll go back and forth. And we got plenty of time for Q&A, so we'll go back and forth between in-room and online. I'll start right here.
Wow, this is why I love to sit in the front. Thank you. Thank you, Ben. First of all, thank you so much for this presentation. Especially, I feel like those apps give us something to work with. One question I had as you were talking about, you mentioned the word clear, but it would be great to have some examples because I think clear can be very subjective. I think most people think they're communicating clearly when they're not. And I can say as a daughter of immigrant mom who she actually, when she speaks English, kind of has a Jewish New York accent because she learned English from my dad and my Jewish grandma. But it's interesting, like, when using something like text to speech, for example, I find that if I'm not enunciating perfectly, often I will be frustrated with that. My mom has a tendency to save her kind of what she calls like bloopers on text to speech when she's using it. My question to you is like, how do we define what is clear? And I would think that it's very individual, depending on what country you're coming from. So anyway, lots of thoughts. I'll catch you for more of them later. But thank you so much for this. Lot of food for thought. Appreciate it.
I think for clarity, I think the more subjective thing are the reading level calculators. There are also like lists of vocabulary that is expected on a certain level. But yeah, I think it totally depends on the context, on the context that a person is interacting at. Some people are super proficient in one topic of a language, but then if you move away from that, like if you move to medicine or something, or if you listen to a MTA announcement, you suddenly are really not proficient in understanding. Yeah.
Everybody can hear the.
Yeah.
One from online. Are there recent studies that looked at what spoken English is most widely accessible, such as British English in a lower pitch, for example?
Ooh, this is a good question. I'm gonna look it up. So I'm gonna look it up and
Check back on the Slack.
Yes.
If you're part of our Slack community, which I'll shout out later, we can answer follow questions there. Another in the room? Yeah, sure. I'll come back over here. I'll just make brief here.
Thank you. Just real quick, what should we know or consider in terms of iconography when considering creating an experience with limited English proficiency?
That's a good question. Yeah. I feel like there are some icons that are pretty easy to understand that are very widespread and partially like thanks to Facebook because we have the gear for a setting and we have the person outline for the profile or like I feel like there are so many universal ones. I love how MTA does it with turn around and go to the other side of the station, right? It does this weird U-turn thing that I don't remember seeing in other places. Right? I feel like when you see an icon that is understandable, you know that this is an understandable icon. Oh, or like I think this question also comes up a lot with the floppy disk for save, right? And it's not a question of the language proficiency, but also of the exposure to something and generation. I don't know.
Yeah.
Or is iconography like idioms?
Right.
Oh.
For online, are some icons like idioms? Are they cultural?
Right. I think at some point there was this like Google image study where they asked people to draw like a house or a fish in a certain way, and then they put all of those images together, and you kind of see that the house is mostly like a square with a triangular roof and whatever. But if you look at a fish, then the majority of fishes are swimming left to right, but there were a few like fainter outlines of a fish swimming right to left. So definitely cultural, I feel.
Yeah. One thing we find in our testing is that pairing an icon, like even when there's very little space, trying to find a way to pair an icon with a label, because there are, often in user testing, we find that something we all think, well, obviously it's super obvious. Nobody would not understand what that is. And invariably, a reasonable percentage of the users we test with just go, yeah, that was not apparent to me at all. So we definitely have kind of groupthink, even when we think we're being inclusive. So we've definitely found that pairing labels, or even just not using icons and just using text labels whenever possible, makes it both more kind of cognitively accessible and easier to localize and easier to internationalize as well. But designers love icons.
And labels on the buttons. Buttons with a label and an icon.
Yes. Do you feel that designs in everyday life have gotten better at plain language in the last years? Like, are things improving in the space?
Okay, so I've only lived in the States for 10 years, so I cannot, say much about like how MTA improved in those 10 years. People who lived here longer probably have a better answer. I think, so I don't know, but my thought would be that now we can do more testing because of internet and more access to users, right? We can gather more data. I think that, we are predestined for it to be improving and being clearer. Also, how good will we be trained to talk to technology after years of interacting with AI, right? And you need to be clear talking to ChatGPT, otherwise you will get something unclear. So I think we're gonna just get better.
So thank you, Irina, for sharing this great insight with us. I have a comment that leads to a question. would have been great to see examples of some of the points you made. Like, for example, the pausing after every sentence, if there was like an audiobook or something like that that has that, so we can see what that looks like in practice. Because some of these things were a little unclear on like what kind of standards I should be aiming for. So maybe in the follow-up on the Slack, if you could put examples of some of these points that you made on your slides so that I can better internalize. Because the saying goes, tell me and I forget, show me and I might remember, involve me and I'll understand. So seeing examples of some of these principles that you're designing would have been really helpful.
Can I repeat what you said?
Yes.
Okay, just to verify that I understood it. So you said to find and post examples where, let's say, something is more difficult to understand with limited.
Yeah, some of these design principles, like the audiobook one that you had about the pausing after every sentence, I'm like, I don't know of any examples of that in
Okay.
practice, so it'd be great to see that. So the question is that for how helpful is the phonetic spelling technique for limited English learners? Because I find when I'm speaking to people that have a hard time pronouncing or understanding terms, I use that technique to help them learn how to say certain things. Have you seen that technique in use, or is it not really useful for technology?
Can you give an example?
Phonetic. So spelling the name, like for example, my name, in Spanish is pronounced Jose, in English it's pronounced Jose. The Asian pronunciation is Jose. So obviously it's spelled differently and stuff like that. So I use the technique phonetic spelling for like Asians in general to say it's actually pronounced Jose, Hose-A. So you spell it syllable by syllable.
Okay.
And this is really useful for complex words, terminology, things like that, things that aren't normal. So have you seen phonetic spelling in use where you spell it syllable by syllable?
I can think of, like, the names are such a good example.
Yeah.
Whenever I introduce myself to someone, I'm like Irina, and people are like, what? And I'm like, well, especially around Halloween, it works really good because I'm like Irina, like eerie, and it works great. But yeah,
Okay.
I-
So not yet.
I think like especially with English, spelling things out like letter by letter is not super helpful because W is not pronounced D.
That's why I said it's syllable by syllable. It's not.
Got it.
Yeah. So it's like you break down the word into how it's pronounced so that the person can learn it. I was just curious if we've seen that in the text scene. Okay. And then the last question that I have is going back to Xian's question about intent versus impact, because it's a really big deal. Like, you think you got it clearly, but obviously, and you were mentioning this too, Ben, in your user testing, like somebody inevitably won't understand. Are there any good ways to benchmark that you're not locked in this like echo chamber or principles that you've seen that could help us make sure that we're really designing for a population that we usually don't have much understanding of?
I mean, I think the guidelines that like the U.S. federal guidelines on plain language are great. Again, US.gov guidelines are really good. But yeah, testing. I love the echo chamber mentioned.
There are not specifically. There are kind of broad reach user testing platforms like Maze and similar, where you can for relatively affordable cost do kind of a broad range of testing. They're not disability specific testing. They're not like Fable or something like that, but it's kind of broad, larger user pool for relatively low cost per user, and you can target, you can slice down to a reasonable subset of different user groups, and some of them do identify with alternate primary language, so might be another resource. Let's see. Do you have advice on making audiovisual and multimedia content accessible in multiple languages? You touched on this, I think, during the presentation a bit, right?
Yeah, I also, if we talk about multiple languages here, it's important to think like how many languages can you include, right? And here user testing, not user testing. Well, I guess user testing, like knowing your target audience is really important. The dominating languages will be different depending on the country or depending on the region, even in the States, right? And there, let's say 2 to 5, like translating your website or product into, ideally 2 to 5 top spoken languages in that specific region under your the clients that you're users that you're targeting is the goal.
Go back. And then I'll come back around to the front.
Thank you so much for the talk. I was curious about, I think, touching on one of the answers you gave earlier. How do you make very complicated systems such as like healthcare or finance, like with your annual percentage rate example, how do you make those more accessible for people with limited English proficiency? Is it sort of just like giving them like an info button to like learn like a definition of something?
So if we talk about abbreviations, then it's mentioning the whole phrase first, like annual percentage rate, and then mentioning the acronym in the brackets, and then you can continue using the acronym because you already referenced it when you first time mentioned it. Like if you write about accessibility, you don't want to start with A11Y. You want to start with accessibility brackets A11Y, right? And then you can continue using it. I feel like having additional information like in a tooltip is usually not a super good idea, because whatever is not, oh my God, not unwrapped, but collapsed, expanded, whatever is not expanded will probably not be read. But on the other hand, if this is something that, you know, appears over and over on your website, I feel like with the WCAG guidelines, we have some terms that also have like a tooltip, but then you also can go down, and then this is where all the terms are explained. I mean, theoretically, you can also have like a separate, I don't know, footer area where you explain all the things, but that would be so much, and then you would have to repeat it on every page.
So would like a glossary help?
Yeah, but then you would have to like either repeat it or reference it over and over. Yeah.
People like that, like the term in being like the boss and everywhere. The beer.
That's true.
The comment
Yeah.
online was you could link the glossary term.
Also, I think like a really good example is that we have Wikipedia in easy English. Oh, so sorry, simple English, right? So that's also such a good example of like the complex situation, but also using the basic information with basic words.
Meryl from online also had a comment. She said a lot of Irina's advice is very similar to the best practices in captions and subtitles. There's a reason why they're best practices.
Okay. Thank you for all this information. I was wondering if you had any ideas or guidance on evaluating some of these techniques at scale. I think something I've been trying to do with my own work is sort of figure out like identifying areas that need improvement and also evaluating areas where we've made improvements and seeing if they've performed as we expected. Because I find like reading levels and things like that to be very not helpful in that regard.
I need to maybe think a little bit about this. Let me take it with me, and then again, I'll post it. Maybe if you can ping me on LinkedIn or like in okay.
Another from online regarding icons on the contract I work on. We always use icon plus label. I know not possible in all circumstances, but maybe doable in more cases than we think. All right, another one I think up front here.
So first of all, a great job with the presentation. This was really fascinating to think about as it applies to my work that I have coming up. But my question is, so you mentioned all of these apps that that could translate the content into different languages, but but the apps aren't accurate. So are there so once the content gets copied and pasted into the website, is it checked by a human that actually knows the language
that's actually a great question, and this goes back to the question about like how to deal with the multilingual content on a website. We cannot really rely on machine translation without not spell checking it, but without proofreading it and verifying that it actually makes sense. Does this answer your question, or your question going away?
Well, I was just wondering, like, well, are there like is it someone's job to translate? Well, not to translate, but to like look over the content that the machine writes, like that sort of thing.
Yes. I think there definitely should be someone's job to a content designer, a hired translator, whoever does that. But we need a human who understands the context. I know that we had a talk about how much AI can do last month.
Yep.
I want to push for humans.
AI plus humans is the right. Yep. Okay. I think we are, in order to let our interpreter and captioner go on time, I think we are at time for questions. But for anyone in the room here, feel free to continue the conversation. Stick around.
Let me show my slide.
Oh,
with
yes.
the email if you have any questions, and also the QR code for LinkedIn. And thank you so much. There is a very royal cap here too. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina.